Today we're going to talk about the case of a 13-year-old boy who seemed like the kind of son anyone would want. An honors student, good grades, not a single problem at school or at home, no prior incidents. Everyone who knew him used the same phrase to describe him, and that phrase was that he was a good boy. And one ordinary night, this good boy picked up the phone, dialed 911, and in a calm voice told the operator to send someone to his apartment because something had just happened to his mother. What is still hard to believe is how someone could have done something like that. Today we're going to talk about the case of Rosa. To give you some context, everything happened in Hialeah, which is a city in Miami-Dade County, Florida, with a huge Cuban community, one of those places where everyone knows each other and people speak Spanish on every corner. And in an apartment complex called Amelia Oaks, on 79th Place, there lived a family that, up until that night, had been completely normal. A mother named Irina Garcia, 39 years old. She was Cuban, who worked at a beauty salon in the area. And there was also her partner named Frank Ramos, a Cuban man who was a truck driver, and because of his job he spent a lot of time away from home, even out of the state. There was her baby, a newborn girl named Ashley, who had just been born on September 29. So on the night we're gonna talk about, she was 14 days old, and then there was her oldest son. A 13-year-old boy who was in 8th grade at a charter school called I Matter Academy. And well, he was a boy who had only good grades at school. Irina and Frank had been together for about 3 or 4 years, although they weren't married. Frank himself sometime later would describe them as a very close family, and he would say that he loved Derek as if he were his own son. Why? Because I should clarify here that Frank was not the boy's biological father, but rather his stepfather. But before you draw your own conclusions, let me tell you that this is not the typical scenario where no one knows where the biological father was. We can assume that in that regard Derek was somewhat lucky, because his father, named Rosa, was indeed present in the boy's life. Now one thing is quite certain. That on the night of October 12, 2023 in that apartment, neither Frank nor the biological father were there. Only the mother, the 14-day-old baby, and the 13-year-old son were there. That night, like every night, Irina made sure the house was calm before going to sleep. She had the newborn by her side in the crib next to the bed, and her older son was in his room. And as far as we know, nothing seemed different from any other night in that apartment. She lay down and fell asleep. While she was sleeping, at some point in the early morning, someone entered her room. That person stood next to the bed, over her, and started stabbing her right there, where she was sleeping without understanding what was happening. And that someone, as hard as it may be to believe or understand, was not an intruder who had forced their way in or a thief. Nor was it a stranger. It was her own 13-year-old son. We know this in quite some detail. In fact, that's because he himself would later recount it. That night, Derek went to sleep around 10 p.m. But at some point, he got up, went to the kitchen, grabbed one of the knives, a big one with a purple handle, and walked down the hallway to his mom's room while she was asleep. And there, standing over her, he started to attack her, as we just mentioned. We also know this for sure because there was a baby monitor in that room. One of those little cameras that parents use to watch over the baby while they sleep. And that camera recorded footage of a person attacking the woman that same night. Of course, these videos were not released in their entirety due to the graphic nature of their content. And also to protect Derek, who, let's remember, was a minor, or is a minor to be more precise. This means that whatever happened inside that room, no matter how hard it is to imagine, everything was recorded. And it wasn't just one or a few stabs that Irina received. When they later performed the autopsy, the medical examiner counted 46 knife wounds spread across her back, neck, throat, and face. And one of those hit an artery. And that's why there was so much blood that it reached the floor and even the base of the crib where the baby was sleeping. And something that really doesn't seem strange to me is that Derek, in the middle of all that, didn't do absolutely anything to his little sister. He left her there, safe and sound, sleeping just a few meters away from where he had just killed their mother. Obviously, at this point in the story, we can assume that he knew who he wanted to attack and who he didn't. And even though all of this sounds strange, you have to pay attention to what happened next, because this is even stranger. This boy saw what he did with his own hands, and instead of running away and fleeing, he grabbed his phone, took pictures of his mom's body, and sent them to a friend. And on top of that, he took a selfie with his hand covered in blood and sent that to this friend as well. That friend, when the police contacted him sometime later, said that the boy was joking and laughing about what he had done. Only after all that did he call 911. The call lasted almost 18 minutes, and he stayed on the line with the operator until the police arrived. And if you listen to this recording that the police eventually released, what is most unsettling is how calm this guy sounded throughout the entire conversation. He asked her to send a patrol car to his house, and when the operator asked about his mom, he replied that she was dead, that there was blood all over the floor.
Couldn't bring the police over here where I live. What is your address? I don't know my address. I'm only 13. But miss, I killed my mom. Okay, so my mom died. I killed her. How did you kill your mom? I dropped her from the kitchen, and while she was sleeping, I kicked her in the throat and in the back.
When the operator asked him why he did it, he said he didn't want to be alive anymore. Then he said that he was going to kill his mother and then himself, but later he ended up regretting it. He told the operator that there was a gun in the living room, and in fact, this gun was loaded. He also said that he pulled the slide back to, hurt himself, but in the end he didn't do it because he didn't want to. He assured the operator that his little sister was fine and the baby was safe in her crib. And with that same calm, he also told her about the photos he had sent to this friend and asked her in these words if that was wrong. Later, at one point, he even apologized for having killed his mother. And when the police could already be heard arriving at the door, Derek asked the operator one last question. He asked her if they were going to kill him, and she told him no, that they were there to help him and his family. There's even a video. Taken from the security camera, it shows this 13-year-old boy coming out of the apartment with his hands up, surrendering to the approaching police officers. And the truth is, it's an image that we can say is shocking because it's a child, a teenager, coming out of the crime scene with his hands up where he had just killed his own mother. The next day, the Hialeah police held a press conference and a lieutenant said they were stunned, speechless. And the thing is, nothing they found matched what you would expect when entering a scene like that. Because Derek had been, according to him, quite polite throughout the entire call. It was all yes ma'am and no ma'am. And when they started looking into his life, they came across the least suspicious profile you could possibly imagine. An honors student with good grades, no problems at school or at home, and no known history of mental health issues. That same night of the crime, the police spoke with the grandmother, with Isabella Costa, who was Irina's mother. There's a video of that interview, it's about 13 minutes long, inside a car, in which a detective keeps asking her questions, while she, increasingly distressed, starts to suspect the worst. Because they still hadn't told her exactly what had happened. They had called her to go to the apartment, but no one was explaining to her what had happened. And in that interview, when the detective asked her about her grandson, She described him as a calm boy with no medical or mental problems. She said that Irina and Derek never had problems with aggression and that he respected his mother a lot. And during this interview, the grandmother said something that, in light of everything that happened afterward, is shocking to hear. Because she says that boy is an angel. That woman, in the span of a single night, ended up losing her daughter and her grandson at the same time. Her daughter because she had just been murdered, and her grandson who had become his mother's killer. And obviously, at that moment, he was being arrested. The main mystery that everyone was left with that first week was that there was no motive. There was no history of abuse behind it. There was no fight that night. There was absolutely nothing to explain why a guy like that, out of nowhere, would kill his mom by stabbing his mom 46 times. While she was sleeping. A few hours after the crime, still in the early morning, the police placed Derek in an interrogation room. And there are videos of that too, a video that later became one of the central pieces of the whole case. In that recording, you see a calm young man while a detective asks him directly if he killed her, to which he replied yes. Nodding his head, he was asked what kind of knife he used, and he described it in detail. It was a large kitchen knife. And he even remembered to mention that the handle was purple. When the detectives asked him where he had cut her, he pointed to his own neck. With a matter-of-fact calm that left the police stunned, he explained to them that he did it right there, looking for a vein that runs along both sides of the neck. At one point during the recording, he even showed them his hands, still stained with blood. However, a crucial moment changed everything. While the investigators focused on the how, the details, the weapon, and the location, the young man answered without any trouble. The drastic turn happened when they changed their strategy and asked him why. As soon as they wanted to know his reasons, Derek completely shut down and demanded a lawyer. The investigator then asked him if he wanted to stop the interrogation, and the interview ended at that moment. And it's a contrast that personally impresses me, because this is a guy who confesses how he did all of this. He described the mechanics of the crime with complete calm, like someone telling what they did over the weekend. But at the exact second he's asked this question, the why, the motivation, he starts to shut down. And honestly, it has to be said that he never gave a reason or motive. We're talking about more than 2 years passing since the case, and up until now, he hasn't given us a motivation. As time went by, as the prosecution started to build the case, things started to come out that completely changed that image of the good boy everyone talked about, and almost everything that came out was stored on his phone. When they conducted a forensic analysis of the phone, they found that Derek had literally searched for the best place to stab a person. Another one of his searches was a diagram of the carotid artery. It's a small knife, good for killing. It's easier to kill someone with a small knife. Can a knife cut bone? Because we could be talking about a sudden fit of madness in a single night, something impulsive that someone could do. I'm not sure if it's about understanding or justifying it, since something mental is happening then. But it's still terrible, obviously. But someone who sits down and searches the internet for the best place to stab a person, they already had it in mind beforehand. That couldn't be called an impulse anymore. I mean, they were already planning it. The same goes for Google searches. Even though they're evidence, they always are. They're circumstantial evidence. That's something we need to understand. Because just because someone searches for something on the internet doesn't mean they went to pages to read about it or to view illegal content, or that they committed a crime. But it is often used to show the mentality or personality of the person. And there was more, because the prosecution argued that Derek had what they called a morbid fascination with blood, death, and gore. The day before he killed his mom, He told a friend that he was planning to dress up as Jason for Halloween, the character from the Friday the 13th movies, the one with the machete and the hockey mask. That's why investigators believe it's possible that he might have chosen that day to carry out the attack because of Friday the 13th, because remember, he carried out the attack just a few hours before it became Friday the 13th. On the morning of the incident, Derek had shown his girlfriend a video of a man shooting himself. While they were on the school bus, the young woman later told investigators that Derek was laughing and joking while showing her the video, which led her to break up with him. Derek had also sent the bloody video to a group chat with his friends. And remember the photos that he himself mentioned in the 911 call, the ones he sent to his friends? Well, the prosecution revealed that when he shared certain material in a group chat, he added an emoji, and the emoji was a smiley face with a gun pointing at its head. For the prosecutors, all of this together, the searches, the fascination with this kind of content, the mocking and playful way in which he shared what he had done, everything pointed to something very different from an uncontrollable impulse. It pointed to premeditation, to a guy who knew exactly what he was doing, that he planned it, and on top of that, he even seemed to feel a kind of pride in what he did, because he looked proud and also mocking, both when sharing the video of this intense scene that he showed to his girlfriend, as well as in the messages after the homicide. After that, now we could leave the case up to that point, but the truth is it was much more complicated and complex than what we just told, because this case had two opposing versions for more than 2 years. Because there was also the defense's version, which was very different from the prosecution's. Derek's lawyers insisted from the beginning that there was a diagnosis involved here, that this changed everything according to them and according to the medical records. This boy had ADHD, and he was on the autism spectrum, and he was emotionally and cognitively immature for his age, a psychologist from the correctional health system. She testified that Derek did indeed have ADHD, that another doctor had placed him on the spectrum. For the defense, the fact that Derek admitted on the call to having thought about shooting himself. It was not the portrait of a cold and calculating killer, but that of a troubled teenager who didn't even understand the magnitude of his actions. Based on this premise, the defense's main strategy was to ask the judge to invalidate the confession for the trial, arguing that a minor who had just turned 13 and had no legal experience couldn't really understand his right to remain silent, especially when he was seen, visibly confused by the technical terminology used by the investigators. The prosecution refuted this argument from the defense, pointing out that when asked about his condition, the young man responded completely calmly, that he was fine, showing neither confusion nor distress. The detective in charge testified that he took special care due to the minor's age, making sure he understood his Miranda rights, and stated that Derek communicated clearly, alertly, and coherently. However, the case took an unexpected turn when the defense began to explore a different alternative theory that pointed to another suspect. We're talking about the stepfather, Frank Ramos. According to the lawyers, there were Facebook conversations in which Frank detailed very specific aspects of the crime, such as the victim screaming for help, and she defended herself from her attacker, which left an obvious question hanging in the air. If he hadn't been at the scene that night, how did he know with such precision all these details? As if that weren't enough, the defense presented arguments based on the laboratory analyses of the kitchen knife, claiming that the interpretation of the genetic profiles found suggested the presence of genetic material from another person, implying that it could be Frank himself who killed Irina. But the prosecution stopped that line of argument cold. The arguments, well, simply that there was no evidence that Frank was present at the crime, and that all the evidence, the documents and the videos showed that he was in Georgia that night in the state of Georgia, working hundreds of kilometers away. In fact, the way Frank found out about everything was by watching through the Ring camera in the apartment. At the moment when the police arrived and arrested Derek, the man, he was far away, watching in real time on his phone as they took his stepson away, and Frank Ramos himself responded to these accusations. He said he was just another victim in all of this, that he didn't have to explain anything to anyone, and that it was the prosecutors who had control of everything. This process was extremely long, more than 2 years, because Derek was charged as an adult. A grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder. And that's in the state of Florida. Even if you're 13 years old, it can mean life in prison or a minimum of 40 years in jail. The death penalty didn't apply to him because of his age. But everything else was still on the table. While he was waiting for trial, Derek, who was 13 years old, was held in an adult jail, separated from the adult population for his own safety. But in extremely harsh conditions. The defense fought several times to have him transferred to a juvenile center, arguing that he wasn't even receiving the education he was entitled to by law. His father and grandmother, they even begged for him to be granted house arrest, but the judge said there wasn't enough evidence that his rights were being violated in the adult prison, and that because of him being a great threat, he had to be treated as an adult. At one point something came to light, a fact that is quite shocking in this case, and that is in March 2024. This boy had only been out of his cell for about 119 hours in the entire month. And out of those 119 hours, only 5 were for educational purposes. The rest of the time, he was practically isolated. While all this was happening, a pretty big support movement was forming. People started showing up. At the hearings, people wore shirts that said "Justice for Derek." Other shirts read, "He is not an adult, he is a child." There was even an online petition. They asked for him to be tried as a minor, not as an adult. This petition gathered almost 32,000 signatures. All the groups of people on social media who support and believe that Derek is supposedly innocent say that during Derek's 911 call, another voice can be heard in the distance, which makes them think that there was someone else there. They also say that in the photo taken from the baby monitor video, you can see the figure of a man attacking Derek's mother, and supposedly this figure doesn't look like Derek because it looks like more robust. But it also has to be said, this could be because of the camera angle. Others simply say that he was a child at the time of the incident and that he deserves to be treated as such. And his grandmother, Isabella Costa, the same one who, that first night, had said the boy was an angel, came out again and again to ask for mercy for her grandson, and to defend him before the authorities and the media. At the beginning of the judicial process, Derek and his lawyers presented and defended a not guilty plea, and a claim of innocence, after 2 years of anticipation. The trial never took place. On January 16, 2026, Derek Rosa, already 15 years old, he appeared before the court to plead guilty to second-degree murder through a plea agreement with the prosecution. In this way, he avoided the original first-degree charge in exchange for a sentence of 25 years in prison and 20 years of probation. That day in the courtroom, Frank Ramos, the stepfather, spoke. The same one the defense had tried to point to as an alternative suspect. He told him that to him, Derek had been like a son, that they were a very close family. He told him that his mom had been a loving and devoted mother, an excellent person, and that losing her had destroyed the family, changing their lives forever. And he also told him, looking him in the eyes, that nothing justified what he had done. And right after those words, when it was Derek's turn to speak, this guy only said one sentence. He said, "I'm sorry, that's all, Your Honor." The agreement, by the way, includes a couple of things that I want to mention, because when Derek gets out of prison after those 25 years, usually the 25 years are not fully served if there is good behavior. A court is going to evaluate him to determine what mental health needs he may have at that time, and that could include a period of treatment. On the other hand, another condition of the agreement is that Derek has to stay away, forever, from both his stepfather and his little sister. From baby Ashley, who was sleeping that night, just a few meters away from her mother, who had been murdered. But this story doesn't end here, because even though the case is already legally closed, with a confession, a guilty plea, and a final sentence, it seems to me that there's a question that was left open, and it probably will never be closed, and deep down, this case always. There were two stories, telling the same thing, from opposite sides. On one hand, we have the prosecution's version. The one about the boy who sat down to search on the internet where to stab a person, who said he wanted to be like Jason, the one from the horror movies, who stabbed his mom 46 times while she was sleeping, and then took pictures of the body to send them, laughing, to his friends, with a smiley face. That version is about a killer who knew exactly what he was doing. He planned it ahead of time, and even enjoyed the impact it caused. On the other hand, we have the version from the defense and the family. The one about the 13-year-old boy with ADHD. And on the autism spectrum, emotionally immature. That he had thoughts of hurting himself the night he was arrested. That according to his grandmother, he was an angel. And for all the people who went out wearing t-shirts to defend him, he was nothing more than a sick boy whom a system that was too harsh decided to treat as an adult. I also heard that there are many people who believe that he was abused. There is evidence of that, we didn't find it, but there are many people who believe so. The whole story is not being told. And the defense's version is one of tragedy. Of someone who maybe didn't even realize what he was doing. And the only person who could have tipped the scales one way or the other. The only one who really knew what was going through his mind that night. He decided not to tell. He pleaded guilty. He accepted his 25-year sentence. And he took with him the only question that really mattered in this whole case. What exactly led him to do this? A 13-year-old boy with good grades and no prior record. His lawyer, Elisette Riello, published after the conviction a long message, very personal, full of reflections and of gratitude, and she ended it by saying, with time, they will find answers. And hopefully they're right. Hopefully they'll emerge over time, because as of today, the truth doesn't exist, right? That's it for today's case. I look forward to your comments below. I know this is a very controversial case. I want to know if you agree with the prosecution's version, the defense's version, or the public's version, because we also talked that there are a lot of people, I saw this in TikTok videos, I saw it in blogs, on social media, that people believe that here they're not telling us the whole story, that maybe there was abuse. As I said, there's no evidence of that. At least we didn't find any. If you know about that, write it down below. This way we'll meet again in the next story.